In this Elden Ring video, I'm going to be showing my Blazing Blackblade build. This is another all-game build that can be played from the very beginning of the game, and here we're using the Hookclaws, which is one of the claw weapons that I got to use in our claws video, and I really like this weapon, so let's get into the build. So the reason that I like the Hookclaws over the other claws in Elden Ring is, first of all, you can get these weapons in Stormveil Castle. So it's not too far into the game, which just allows you to really put this together as a early game build that you can use through one successive playthrough. Some of the other claws are not found until later. But secondly, I really like the length of these claws. They're the longest claws in Elden Ring. And when you're using shorter weapons, attack length can become a big issue when you're fighting weird shaped enemies and bosses and stuff like that. So having the extra reach, even though the damage of the hook blades is probably lower than a lot of the other claws, several of the other claws, it's not the lowest, but it's not in the high end of attack power. And I think the length makes up, because when you miss an enemy, you don't deal any damage. So I really like the length of it. You get them pretty early on, allows you to put this build together rather quickly. So essentially what I've done with this weapon is I've stuck the Flaming Strike Ash of War on it and set it to the Flame Art Infusion. Flaming Strike is found near Redmane Castle or behind Redmane Castle, so it's not super far into the game. You would have to make a ride over there. Otherwise, you can use something else in the meantime, like Endure or something like that. Eventually, you want to pick this up. It's not a must-have for this build. Mainly what we're looking for from that is the, Flame Art setting. You could use Flames of the Redmane just for the Flame Art early on, and then swap to that once you pick it up. And what I really like about Flame Art for this build is it allows us to meet the minimum requirements for the weapon, 8 strength, 14 dexterity, and then just crank Faith sky high, which allows us to use basically any incantation we want that doesn't require high arcane. So you can use Flame Grant Me Strength, which is particularly good for this setup because you're doing physical and fire damage. Golden Vow boosts your damage. Any other spells you want to add to this build, you can, and you can use whatever seal you want. Eventually, obviously, you'll use the Erdtree seal because you'll have 80 Faith, but you can use other seals along the way depending on what you pick up and what spells you favor. So what this allows us to do is get pretty good damage off the weapons themselves. This is further amplified by the fire that's put onto the weapons from Flaming Strike. Then we get the buff of Golden Vow and Flame Grant Me Strength. Admittedly, you will probably only use these during boss fights or hard to kill enemies because you simply don't need it out on the landscape. Normally, you have plenty of attack power as the weapons themselves, especially once they're buffed with Flaming Strike, and you can use that Ash of War for high damage as well. But those really kick the attack power up to 1k attack power, something like that when you're fully buffed up, maybe even higher depending on the stacking hit buffs you get from like Rotten Wing, Sword Insignia, and stuff like that. So you get really high attack power, and then periodically when you're fighting a boss or something, you'll trigger Hemorrhage as well. Like, you're not really going for Hemorrhage, but eventually it'll trigger and rip off a chunk of health, and bosses just melt with a setup because you're attacking so rapidly and dealing so much damage, they don't stand a chance. So for armor for this build, I've gone with a Malekith set. Now, this is not an early game armor, so if you're playing early game, you probably want to use something like the Knight set, which also has 51 poise. You can get Round Table Hold pretty early on, but if you're playing late game or New Game Plus, I really love Malekith's armor set, and it kind of just looks awesome. You have these flaming claws and this black beast-like armor. Just kind of set the mood. It's just like awesome to look at, so I really like that. Again, really what you're looking for here is for an armor set that has at least 51 poise, so when you're going ham with your attacks and an enemy hits you or a boss hits you, you can keep swinging through that attack and continue to build up your attack power and damage on them. Talisman-wise for this build, I have the Fire Scorpion Charm to further boost fire damage. This is good for the fire part of Flaming Strike, and also you deal about 60% to 70% fire damage anyway with regular attacks. So that's a good boost. You do lose a little protection with that, but not a ton. We make up for that with the Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman to give us even more protection. That way when you're trading hits, you don't die as easily. And then you can use Shard of Alexander, or if you're playing early on, Warrior Jar Shard to further boost Flaming Strike damage. This isn't 100% necessary in my opinion. I use Flaming Strike to buff my weapons more than I use it as an attack, I find. But, you want to make sure that, you're getting the most damage out of it if you're using it regularly. So this is not a bad one to have. And then my fourth slot, I have Rotten Winged Sword Insignia. This could be Millicent's Prothesis, or it could be Winged Sword Insignia, depending on what you have in the game. I find that, you could double stack these if you can get someone to drop you one, put Millicent's Prothesis and Rotten Winged Sword Insignia or whatever late game. But it's not necessarily necessary. You could replace Dragon Crest Great Shield Talisman for that, but I just find that your damage is so high anyway. I prefer the protection just to be able to trade damage and not die. But it's really up to you. You could use any combination of those. And as I mentioned for spells, really the only two I'm using here are Flame Grant Me Strength and Golden Vow, which is very situational. You don't really need to use them out on the landscape. Again, you can add any spell or incantation that you can basically want in this build that doesn't have tons of arcane requirement or intelligence requirement, because you just have plenty of faith with this build. So if you like, defensive buffs, or if you like offensive spells, whatever you like, you can mix it in, even though you won't see it here in my gameplay. Attribute-wise for this build, I have 50 Vigor, 35 Mind, 25 Endurance, 8 Strength, 14 Dexterity, 16 Intelligence, although you don't need any Intelligence, 80 Faith, and 10 Arcane for this build. Again, you don't need an Arcane or Intelligence at all. Arcane is really the only way you might need it is if you want to meet the requirements for some spells, which is totally fine. Like, you could get Swarm of Flies or something like that and throw it in there if you want. If you want to meet the Arcane requirements. I just happen to play it as an Astrologer for this build, which is why my Intelligence is so high. But you don't need any Intelligence for this build. And the reason we have 35 Mind here is that you have a lot of buffing spells. Like, you have Golden Vow, Flame Grant Me Strength, and then you're using Flaming Strike somewhat regularly. You can get away with lower Mind here because I really only use the spell buffs when I'm in boss fights. But if you are playing more of a hybrid and you're flinging spells regularly, you're going to want more FP. So having high Mind is not necessarily bad for this build. And it also lets you use Flaming Strike as much as you want, which is great. Endurance-wise, we don't need a ton in terms of equip weight for this build because all we really have are Claws, a Seal, and the armor, and a little bit of weight from the Talismans. There's no heavy weapon or heavy shield or anything like that in this build. But I will say that the full combo that you deal with your Claws is kind of nutty in terms of stamina use. So having more endurance to get more stamina is not bad. And you can use other Talismans also to further increase your stamina, because you'll find, I think, at least that's what I found when playing this build, that you tend to run out of stamina sometimes when you're right in the middle of your chain and you're just blazing away. Boss is about to go down, a couple more hits, and you run out of stamina, and now you're dodging for your life. So you really can't have too much stamina for this build, so you could definitely take endurance higher than this or get stamina some other way. Again, strength and dexterity are just meeting the minimum requirements of the weapon in order to use it, and faith's cranked sky high because of flame art and in order to be able to use spells. So for Flask of Wonders Physique, you can use a Flame Shroud and Cracked here to give you more fire damage. This is good for Flaming Strike and 60 to 70% of your normal attack spam. Or the Thorny Cracked here gives you more damage when you attack repeatedly, like Rotten Wing Sword Insignia, so that's also good. You could use both of those. I find, again, that I have stamina issues the way I'm set up like this, so having one of the Stamina Cracked tiers in there, either more stamina or stamina recovery, can also be good. Your damage is already really high, and running out of stamina is really the only thing that limits your damage, I find. So having stamina in there can also really, really help you. And as far as Great Runes go, the best one for this build is essentially Radon's, because you're getting more HP, you're getting more FP, and you're getting more stamina. And again, you really need that stamina for this build. So that stamina is going to come in super handy. The FP will help with all the buffs and stuff you have. And the HP is just great for trading damage. So Radon's definitely the way to go for a great run. So that wraps up the Blazing Blackblade build. I hope you guys enjoyed this one. This is another really, really fun build. I've been having a ton of fun putting together new builds. Coming back to the game, I was recently at a concert for Elden Ring. That was kind of like a journey through it. That was great. Really got me revitalized into the game and just like super excited for Shadow of the Erdtree. Love cranking out this content. Can't wait to do, wrap up the fists video, get into the other weapons, like the seals and staffs and stuff, and just crank out some more builds and really talk Shadows of the Erdtree, and then, it'll be here before you know it, and we'll have Shadow of the Erdtree builds, which will just be fantastic. As always, if you have other tips or suggestions for people, you can leave them in the comments, or if you have questions, let me know in the comments below.